The bitter wind cut through Luke Tanner's wool coat like 1,000 tiny knives as he trudged through knee-deep snow toward the eastern boundary of his ranch. February, in the San Mateo Mountains of New Mexico Territory, was merciless, and this winter of 1889 seemed determined to test every man's resolve. His breath formed thick clouds in the freezing air as he checked the fence line, looking for breaks that might let his cattle stray into the wilderness beyond. Luke had been working this land alone for 5 years now, ever since he'd claimed the 160 acres through the Homestead Act. At 32, he was lean and weathered, with hands scarred from barbed wire and eyes that held the cautious watchfulness of a man who'd learned to depend only on himself. The nearest neighbor lived 8 miles west, and the town of Socorro lay a full day's ride north. Out here, loneliness was as much a part of the landscape as the juniper and piñón pine. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Moses, snorted and stamped impatiently as Luke dismounted to examine a section of fence that had collapsed under the weight of snow. As he worked to prop up the fallen posts, his fingers numb despite his leather gloves, he noticed something that made him pause. Fresh tracks in the snow, human footprints, small and unsteady, weaving between the scattered boulders. Luke's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 on his hip. Apache raids had become less common in recent years, but a man couldn't be too careful. He followed the tracks, Moses plodding behind him, the trail leading toward a cluster of large rocks that formed a natural windbreak. What he found there stopped him cold. 2 figures huddled against the largest boulder, so still they might have been mistaken for bundles of rags, if not for the faint vapor of breath rising from them. As Luke approached cautiously, he could see they were young women, Apache, by their dress and hair. The older one, perhaps 18 or 19, had her arms wrapped protectively around a younger girl who couldn't have been more than 14. Both were terrifyingly thin, their faces gaunt with hunger, lips blue with cold. Luke stood there for a long moment, torn. Every instinct bred by years of frontier living told him to walk away. Apache meant trouble. Even if these 2 were alone now, their people might come looking for them. He'd heard enough stories, seen enough burned homesteads and stolen cattle to know the risks. But as he watched, the younger girl's eyes fluttered open. She looked at him with such naked fear and desperation that something twisted in his chest. She tried to speak, but only a weak croak emerged. Her sister stirred then, forcing her own eyes open, trying to position herself between Luke and the younger girl despite barely having the strength to move. "Damn it all to hell," Luke muttered under his breath. He couldn't leave them here to freeze to death. His mother, God rest her soul, would have tanned his hide for even considering it, moving slowly so as not to frighten them further. Luke approached and knelt in the snow. The older sister watched him warily, her dark eyes filled with suspicion and resignation. He held up his hands to show he meant no harm, then pointed to himself and back toward where his ranch lay beyond the ridge. "House," he said slowly, knowing they likely didn't understand English. "Warm, food." The sisters exchanged glances, some wordless communication passing between them. The older one shook her head weakly, but the younger girl whimpered, and Luke could see the internal struggle play out on the older sister's face, pride and fear warring with desperation. "Finally!" She nodded once, shortly. Luke helped them to their feet, alarmed at how light they were, how their legs buckled beneath them. The younger girl couldn't walk at all. After a moment's hesitation, Luke lifted her carefully, trying not to notice how she tensed at his touch or how little she weighed. The older sister leaned heavily against Moses's flank as they made their slow way back through the snow. The journey to his cabin took 3 times longer than it should have. The older sister collapsed twice, and Luke had to alternate between supporting her and carrying the younger girl. By the time they reached the small log structure he called home, snow had begun falling again, heavy flakes that promised another storm. Luke's cabin was modest but sturdy, 2 rooms with a loft, built with his own hands from local timber. He'd chinked the gaps between logs carefully with mud and grass, and the stone fireplace drew well. After settling the sisters near the hearth, He quickly built up the fire until flames roared and warmth began to seep into the cold space. The girls huddled together on his bearskin rug, watching him with those dark, wary eyes as he moved about the cabin. Luke heated water for tea and ladled out bowls of the stew he'd had simmering since morning. Nothing fancy, just beef, potatoes, and wild onions, but nourishing. He set the food before them carefully, then retreated to the far side of the room. Understanding their need for space, they fell upon the food with a desperation that told him they hadn't eaten in days. The older sister tried to maintain some dignity, but hunger won out. When the bowls were empty, Luke refilled them without comment. As warmth and food worked their magic, he could see them beginning to relax fractionally. The younger girl even dozed off, her head in her sister's lap. The older one fought sleep, still watching Luke, but eventually exhaustion claimed her too. Luke sat in his chair by the window, rifle across his knees, and kept watch. Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling around the corners of the cabin. He'd done what any Christian man should do, he told himself. Come morning, when they were strong enough, he'd send them on their way with supplies. That would be the end of it. But as he watched them sleep, so young and vulnerable, he wondered about their story. What had driven them from their people in the dead of winter? Where were they trying to go? The questions nagged at him as the night wore on. Near dawn, the older sister woke with a start, immediately checking on the younger girl. When she saw Luke still keeping watch, something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, or confusion. She said something in Apache, her voice still hoarse. Luke shook his head. I don't understand, he said quietly. She seemed to consider something, then pointed to herself. Maria, she said carefully, the Spanish name sounding strange with her accent. Then she pointed to her sister. Elena, Spanish names. That was unexpected. Luke pointed to himself. Luke, Maria nodded solemnly. She gestured to the food, to the fire, to the blanket he'd draped over them while they slept, then pressed her hands together in what was clearly a gesture of thanks. Over the next days, they developed a crude system of communication through gestures and the few Spanish words Maria knew. Luke learned they had been traveling to the mission school at Santa Fe when they'd become separated from their group in a blizzard. They'd wandered for days, lost and increasingly desperate, before he'd found them. As they recovered their strength, the sisters helped around the cabin. Maria insisted on it, pride demanding she repay his kindness. Elena, shyly at first but with growing confidence, helped with cooking and mending. Luke found himself growing accustomed to their presence, to the sound of quiet voices and laughter that occasionally bubbled up between the sisters. But he knew it couldn't last. They had somewhere to go, people who were probably looking for them. And he had a ranch to run, cattle to tend, a life that didn't include 2 Apache girls who would only bring complications he couldn't afford. On the 5th day, the storm finally broke. Weak sunlight filtered through the windows, and Luke knew it was time. He packed supplies, dried meat, cornmeal, blankets, and tried to explain through gestures that he would take them as far as the main trail to Santa Fe. Maria understood. Her face grew solemn, and she nodded. But as they prepared to leave, she did something unexpected. She removed a small, beaded pouch from around her neck and pressed it into Luke's hands. Speaking earnestly in Apache, he tried to refuse, but she insisted, closing his fingers around the gift. The ride to the trail was silent except for the crunch of snow under Moses's hooves. Luke had borrowed a horse from his small string for the sisters to ride together. At the crossroads, he pointed north toward Santa Fe, then handed Maria the lead rope for the pack mule he'd loaded with supplies. For the school, he said, knowing she wouldn't understand the words but hoping the meaning was clear. Maria's eyes widened. She shook her head, trying to hand back the rope, but Luke was already turning Moses around. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell and rode away without looking back, though he could feel their eyes on him long after the distance should have swallowed them up. Back at his empty cabin, Luke unpacked the beaded pouch Maria had given him. Inside was a small piece of turquoise, polished smooth. wrapped in a scrap of buckskin. He held it up to the light, admiring the deep blue-green color, then carefully placed it on the mantel above his fireplace. The cabin felt different now. Too quiet, too empty. Luke threw himself into his work, checking on cattle that had weathered the storm, repairing damaged fencing, cutting firewood. But at night, sitting by his fire with only the wind for company, he found himself thinking about them, wondering if they'd made it safely to Santa Fe. Hoping they had. It was better this way, he told himself firmly. He'd done his Christian duty. Nothing more. The frontier was no place for softness, no place for attachments that could only lead to pain. He'd learned that lesson already. Learned it hard. But sometimes, despite himself, his hand would stray to the turquoise on the mantel, and he'd remember the gratitude in Maria's eyes. The way Elena had smiled when she'd successfully mended a torn shirt, the brief warmth their presence had brought to his solitary life. Spring would come eventually, bringing its own demands and distractions. Until then, Luke Tanners would do what he'd always done: endure, survive, and try not to think too hard about what might have been. 3 days after the spring roundup, Luke was mending harnesses in the barn when he heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew their destination. His hand moved instinctively to his rifle, propped against the workbench. Through the barn door, he could see them clearly, 3 Apache warriors, their faces painted, sitting their horses with the easy grace of men born to the saddle. Luke's mouth went dry. He'd been expecting this, in a way. You didn't help Apache girls without consequences, even if your intentions were pure. The lead warrior, an older man with silver threading through his long black hair, raised his hand in greeting. No weapons were drawn, though Luke could see rifles in their saddle scabbards. The warrior said something in Apache, his tone formal but not hostile. "I don't speak Apache," Luke called out, not leaving the relative safety of the barn. "No comprende." The warrior nodded as if he'd expected this. He reached into a pouch at his side and withdrew something, the beaded bag Maria had given Luke. He held it up, then pointed to Luke, then to himself, making a connection clear. Understanding dawned. These men were connected to the sisters somehow. Luke slowly stepped out of the barn, rifle held loosely at his side, not threatening but ready. The lead warrior dismounted, a gesture that suggested peaceful intentions. In broken English mixed with Spanish, he managed to convey his message. "You help, Miss Hijas," the Spanish word for daughters. "Chief, he say, thank you, gift coming, 3 days." Before Luke could respond or ask questions, the warriors had remounted and were riding away, disappearing into the juniper brakes as quickly as they'd come. Luke stood there, bewildered, the words echoing in his mind. Gift coming. 3 days. He spent those 3 days on edge, jumping at every sound, checking his ammunition, wondering what kind of gift an Apache chief might send. Horses, maybe. Trade goods. He tried not to think about other possibilities, darker ones involving revenge disguised as gratitude. On the morning of the 3rd day, Luke was feeding the chickens when he saw a lone rider approaching from the east. The horse was a good one, a painted mare with smooth gaits. But it was the rider who made Luke stop and stare. A woman. A white woman. By the look of her, though sun-browned from travel, she wore a simple blue calico dress and a flat-brimmed hat, her auburn hair braided and pinned up properly. She rode astride rather than side-saddle, handling the spirited mare with easy competence. As she drew closer, Luke could see she was perhaps in her mid-20s, with a strong face that might have been called handsome rather than pretty. Her green eyes were direct and challenging as she reined in a respectful distance from the cabin. "Mr. Luke Tanners?" she called out, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. "That's me," Luke replied warily. "And you are?" "My name is Annabelle Morrison," she said, dismounting with fluid grace. "Though the Apache call me something else. Chief Nache sent me." Luke felt his jaw drop. "Sent you? What do you mean? Sent you?" A flash of something, anger, hurt, crossed her features before her expression smoothed into careful neutrality. As a gift, in gratitude for saving his nieces, I'm to be your mail-order bride, I suppose you could say, though the ordering was done without your knowledge. That's absurd, Luke sputtered. You can't give a person as a gift. This is 1889, not what? Annabelle's tone was sharp. Not the Dark Ages. Tell that to the man who paid for me to come from St. Louis as his bride, then decided I wasn't suitable when he saw I walked with a limp. Tell that to the good Christians who left me at a stage station with nothing but the clothes on my back. Luke noticed it then, the slight favoring of her left leg as she stood. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle difference in how she distributed her weight. The Apache found me, she continued, her voice softer now. Half dead from exposure and shame, they took me in, taught me to survive. I've lived with them for 2 years. When Chief Nache heard about you helping Maria and Elena, and I heard the story, she shrugged. I volunteered. Luke was struggling to make sense of this. Why in God's name would you volunteer to be given away to a stranger? Annabelle met his gaze steadily. Because I'm tired of being neither white nor Apache. Because I want a home that's truly mine. Because the chief would have found another way to honor his debt. And that might have been less pleasant for you. And because... She hesitated, then lifted her chin defiantly. Because I was curious about a white man who would risk helping Apache girls in a blizzard. Luke ran a hand through his hair, completely at a loss. Miss Morrison, Annabelle, I appreciate the thought, but you can't stay here. It wouldn't be proper. I could take you to town, help you get back to wherever you want to go. With what money? She asked bluntly. And where would I go? My family in Ohio disowned me when I answered that mail-order bride advertisement. I have no skills except what the Apache taught me. Tracking, hunting, working hides. What town would hire a woman who's lived with Indians? The stark truth of her words hung between them. Luke could see the pride in her stance, the way she held herself despite discussing such humiliating circumstances. She wasn't begging, wasn't playing on his sympathy, just stating facts. I can work, Annabelle said. I can cook, clean, tend animals, even help with branding if needed. I'm not asking for charity or anything else. Just a chance to earn my keep until I can figure out another option. Luke looked at her, then at his cabin, then back at her. Every bit of common sense he possessed screamed that this was a bad idea. A single man and woman, living in proximity, with no chaperone? The gossip alone could ruin them both. And yet, there's a lean-to off the back of the cabin, he heard himself saying. It's rough, but weatherproof. You could stay there, temporary-like, just until you get on your feet. Relief flickered across her features before she schooled them back to neutrality. That would be acceptable. Thank you. Luke helped her unsaddle the painted mare and showed her to the lean-to. It was indeed rough. He'd used it mostly for storage, but Annabelle surveyed it with practical eyes and nodded. I've slept in worse. This will do fine. Over the next days, they established an awkward routine. Annabelle was true to her word. She worked hard, asking for no special consideration. She rose before dawn to start breakfast, tended the vegetable garden Luke had neglected, mended clothes and harnesses with the neat, tiny stitches. She spoke little, moving through the tasks with quiet efficiency. Luke found himself watching her when he thought she wasn't aware, the way she paused sometimes, gazing at the mountains with an expression of longing, the slight hitch in her step that was more noticeable when she was tired, the way she hummed softly while working, melodies he didn't recognize. In the evenings, they ate in near silence, the proprieties maintained by careful distance. But one night, after a week had passed, Luke found himself asking, "The limp, were you born with it?" Annabelle looked up from the shirt she was mending. "Broken leg when I was 12. My father said it wrong. He was drunk." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. "Is that why you answered the advertisement? To get away?" She considered the question. "Partly. But mostly I wanted adventure, to see the frontier, to be something more than an old maid aunt living on charity. A bitter smile twisted her lips. I certainly got my adventure. What was he like, the man who sent for you? Harold Jameson, merchant in Albuquerque, 53 years old. Wanted a young wife to give him sons and impress his business associates. The advertisement didn't mention his age, of course, or his temperament. She set down her mending. When he saw the limp, he said damaged goods weren't worth the train fare. The casual cruelty of it made Luke's hands clench. You could have had the law on him. There are contracts. With what lawyer? What money? What proof? Annabelle shook her head. The deputy in Albuquerque laughed when I tried to file a complaint. Said I should be grateful he didn't want me. At least I was free to find another situation. They lapsed back into silence. But it was different now. Less strained. Luke found himself sharing bits of his own story over the following evenings. His parents' death from smallpox. His decision to come west. The loneliness of building something with no one to share it with. There was a girl once. He admitted one night, surprising himself. Back in Missouri, Catherine Wheeler. We were going to marry, but her father had debts. Sold her off to a banker old enough to be her grandfather. She went along with it to save her family. Did you love her? Annabelle asked softly. Luke considered. I thought I did. Now I think maybe I love the idea of her. Of having someone, when she chose duty over me. It seemed to prove what I'd always suspected. That I wasn't worth choosing. Or maybe she wasn't given a choice, Annabelle said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. Women rarely are. As the days turned to weeks, the awkwardness between them eased into something like companionship. Annabelle proved to have a dry wit that emerged in unexpected moments. She told stories of her time with the Apache, learning to tan hides, the time she'd accidentally insulted a warrior's mother with a mispronounced word. The quiet dignity of the women who'd taken her in without judgment. They saved my life, she said simply. And more than that, they saved my spirit. When everyone else saw me as damaged goods, they saw someone who could learn, could contribute. Luke began to look forward to their evening conversations, to the sight of smoke rising from the chimney when he came in from the range. The cabin felt less empty, more like a home. It scared him. How quickly he'd grown accustomed to her presence. One evening, a month after her arrival, Luke returned to find Annabelle hadn't started supper. He found her sitting on the porch steps, a letter in her hands, her face pale. What is it? He asked, alarmed. She handed him the letter wordlessly. It was from a lawyer in Albuquerque. Harold Jameson was claiming she'd stolen money and goods from him. He was demanding restitution, or he'd press charges. It's a lie, Annabelle said, her voice steady despite the shock in her eyes. I took nothing but what I was wearing. I know, Luke said without hesitation. The certainty in his voice seemed to surprise her. You believe me? Just like that? Just like that? Luke crumpled the letter. He's trying to cause trouble because his pride was hurt. Or maybe he heard you were here and doesn't like the idea of his damaged goods finding a place. Annabelle studied his face. What are you going to do? Luke thought for a moment. Right back. Tell his lawyer that Miss Morrison is employed here as a housekeeper, with proper accommodations and references. That any further harassment will be met with legal action of our own. Sometimes a firm response is enough to make cowards back down. And if it's not? Then we deal with that when it comes. Luke met her gaze. You're not facing this alone, Annabelle. Not anymore. Something shifted in her expression, a softening he hadn't seen before. Thank you, she whispered. That night, as Luke lay in his bed listening to the wind outside, he realized the truth he'd been avoiding, somewhere between that first awkward day and this moment. Annabelle Morrison had become essential to him. Not just for the work she did or the company she provided, but for herself, her strength, her humor, her refusal to be broken by circumstances that would have crushed others. He thought about Chief Nache, about the gift that had seemed so strange and unwelcome. The old chief had known something Luke was only beginning to understand. That sometimes what we need comes in forms we don't expect, brought by paths we would never choose. Outside, snow began to fall again, late for the season but not unheard of in the high country. Luke pulled his blanket higher and let himself imagine, just for a moment, a future where the woman in the lean-to might move into the cabin proper, where the empty spaces in his life might be filled with more than just surviving day to day. It was dangerous thinking for a careful man, but as sleep finally claimed him, Luke found he didn't care. Some risks, he was beginning to understand, were worth taking. The summer heat had settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, making the afternoon work nearly unbearable. Luke was in the barn, stripped to his undershirt, repairing a broken wagon wheel when he heard Annabelle cry out from the direction of the chicken coop. He dropped his tools and ran, fear clutching at his chest. He found her backed against the coop wall, a rattlesnake coiled between her and escape. Her face was pale but calm, her body perfectly still. She knew better than to make sudden movements. "Don't move," Luke said quietly, though he could see she already understood. He eased toward the woodpile, never taking his eyes off the snake. The shovel was there, leaning against the stacked logs. In one smooth motion, he grabbed it and struck, severing the snake's head cleanly. Annabelle sagged against the wall, her composure finally cracking. Luke reached her in 2 strides, his hands going to her shoulders. "Are you hurt? Did it strike?" "No, I'm fine." Her voice shook slightly. "It just startled me. I should have been watching where I stepped." "These things happen," Luke said, but he found he couldn't let go of her shoulders. She was trembling beneath his hands, and suddenly he was aware of how close they were standing, of the way her green eyes had darkened with residual fear. "Luke," she whispered, and there was something in the way she said his name that made his breath catch. He should have stepped back, should have released her and returned to proper distance. Instead, he found himself pulling her against his chest, one hand moving to cradle the back of her head. She didn't resist, instead pressing closer, her fingers clutching at his shirt. They stood that way for a long moment, the boundaries they'd so carefully maintained crumbling like sun-dried clay. When Annabelle finally pulled back enough to look up at him, Luke saw his own confusion and longing reflected in her eyes. "We can't," she said softly, even as her hands remained fisted in his shirt. "It wouldn't be right." "I know," Luke agreed, but he didn't move away. Couldn't. It was Annabelle who finally stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself as if cold despite the heat. I need to finish gathering eggs." Luke watched her disappear into the coop, then stood there staring at the dead snake, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The careful balance they'd maintained for months had shifted in those few seconds, and he didn't know how to restore it. Wasn't sure he wanted to. That evening was stilted, both of them too aware of what had passed between them. Annabelle served supper in near silence, barely meeting his eyes. When the meal was done, she retreated to the lean-to earlier than usual, leaving Luke alone with his thoughts and the memory of how she'd felt in his arms. Sleep eluded him that night. He lay staring at the ceiling, arguing with himself. She was under his protection. He'd given his word that her position here was respectable, as a housekeeper only. To cross that line would make him no better than the men who'd used and discarded her. But another voice, quieter and more honest, whispered that what he felt for Annabelle went far beyond mere desire. It was the way she laughed at his poor attempts at jokes, the pride in her eyes when she'd mastered a new skill, the quiet companionship of evenings spent in comfortable silence, the way his home had become their home without him noticing. The next morning brought a new crisis. Luke was saddling Moses for a trip to check the eastern pastures when Annabelle emerged from the lean-to, moving stiffly. As she reached for the water bucket, the sleeve of her dress pulled back, revealing dark bruises on her forearm. "What happened?" Luke demanded, catching her wrist gently to examine the marks. Annabelle tried to pull away. "It's nothing. I fell yesterday, caught myself badly." But Luke had seen enough to recognize the pattern. Finger marks, as if someone had grabbed her roughly. His blood ran cold. "Someone was here while I was in the North Field yesterday." Her silence was confirmation enough. "Who?" His voice came out rougher than intended. "A drifter," she admitted reluctantly. "He came looking for work, or so he said. When he saw I was alone," she shrugged, trying for nonchalance. "I convinced him to leave." "Convinced him how?" A slight smile touched her lips. "The Apache taught me well. He won't be bothering any other women for a while." Luke felt a surge of pride mixed with fury. She'd defended herself, but she shouldn't have had to. He'd left her alone, vulnerable. "This can't happen again," he said firmly. "I can take care of myself." Annabelle protested. "I've been doing it for years. That's not—" Luke ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "You shouldn't have to. Not here. Not under my protection." "Then what do you suggest? You can't stop working the ranch to stand guard over me." The solution was obvious, hanging in the air between them, but neither wanted to voice it. Finally. Luke took a breath. "You could move into the cabin. The loft is finished now. You could have that space. It would be more proper than continuing as we are, with you in that lean-to." Annabelle studied his face. People would still talk. A single woman in a single man's house. Let them talk. The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. Your safety matters more than gossip. That night, Luke helped her move her few possessions into the loft. It was a nice space, with a window that caught the evening breeze and morning sun. He'd built a ladder with smooth rungs, mindful of her leg, and strung a curtain for privacy. "Thank you," Annabelle said softly as they stood at the base of the ladder. "For everything. I know I've complicated your life terribly. You've changed it." Luke corrected. "There's a difference." The new arrangement brought its own challenges. The cabin felt smaller with both of them in it, the awareness of each other's presence constant. Luke would lie awake listening to her moving about in the loft, the soft sounds of her preparing for bed. Sometimes he caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't read, something between longing and resignation. The tension came to a head 3 weeks later. A summer storm had blown in, fierce and sudden, catching Luke far from shelter as he worked to bring in a spooked heifer. By the time he made it back to the cabin, he was soaked through and shivering despite the warm air. Annabelle took one look at him and went into motion. "Get those wet clothes off," she ordered, turning her back and busying herself at the stove. "I'll heat water for coffee." Luke changed quickly into dry clothes, but the chill had settled deep. He sat by the fire, unable to stop shaking. Annabelle brought him coffee laced with whiskey from his small supply, then surprised him by sitting beside him on the floor, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You're still cold," she observed. "I'll be fine." But she was already moving, grabbing a blanket and wrapping it around both of them, the practicality of shared warmth. She'd learned from the Apache, but there was nothing practical about the way Luke's breath caught as she settled against his side. "Annabelle," he said, his voice strained. "Just until you warm up," she said quietly, but she didn't move away when the shivering stopped. They sat in silence, watching the fire, acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched. "Finally," Annabelle spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "That day with the snake, I've thought about it every night since." Luke's hand found hers beneath the blanket. "So have I. I told myself it was just gratitude," she continued, "that I was confusing relief with something else. But that's not true." Luke turned to look at her, finding her face inches from his own. "What is the truth?" "The truth is that I came here as a gift, an obligation, and somewhere along the way, I started wishing I'd come by choice, that you'd chosen me, not had me thrust upon you by Apache honor debts. Annabelle?" Luke's free hand came up to cup her cheek. "If I'd had a choice of any woman in the territory to share my life with, I'd have chosen you. Not because you cook well or work hard, or even because you're beautiful, but because you make me want to be better than I am, because you've taken this empty cabin and made it a home, Because I can't imagine going back to the silence of before. Tears sparkled in her eyes. You don't know everything about me. The things I had to do to survive with Jameson before I ran. The shame I carry. We all carry shame, Luke said softly. Things we wish we'd done different. But that's the past. What matters is now. And what comes next? And what does come next? Annabelle asked, her hand tightening on his. Luke's thumb traced along her cheekbone, memorizing the feel of her skin. I think that depends on what you want. I know what I want, but you've had too many men making decisions for you. This one has to be yours. Annabelle was quiet for a long moment, searching his face. Then, with deliberate slowness, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and questioning, but it held the promise of so much more. When they parted, Luke rested his forehead against hers. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything, she whispered. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing on the walls. Outside, the storm continued its fury, but inside the cabin, there was only warmth and the quiet recognition of two souls finding their match. Luke pulled back slightly, his sense of honor warring with desire. We should do this right. I should court you proper. Ask for your hand the way you deserve. Annabelle's laugh was soft and slightly bitter. I was sold sight unseen to a stranger, abandoned at a stage station, and given away like a trade good. I think we're past conventional propriety. Luke, maybe so. He agreed. But you deserve better than what you've had. You deserve to be treasured, to be chosen. Then choose me, she said simply. Not because of honor or obligation or Apache gift-giving. Choose me because you want to. I choose you, Luke said, the words coming out fierce and certain. Today and every day after, I choose you. Annabelle Morrison. She kissed him again, deeper this time, and Luke felt the last of his careful control slip away. He'd spent months keeping his distance, maintaining proper boundaries, and now all he wanted was to close every gap between them. But even as passion rose, Luke forced himself to be gentle, mindful of all she'd endured. This would be nothing like what she'd experienced before. This would be about connection, about two people choosing each other freely. Later, as they lay entwined before the dying fire, Annabelle traced lazy patterns on Luke's chest. What happens tomorrow? She asked softly. Tomorrow, we start building a life together, Luke said, pressing a kiss to her hair. No more pretending you're just a housekeeper. No more careful distances. Just us, facing whatever comes. The town will talk, she warned. Your neighbors might not accept a woman who lived with the Apache. Then they're fools, Luke said firmly. And their opinions matter less than nothing to me. Annabelle raised up on one elbow to look at him. You really mean that? I really do. You saved me. Annabelle. Not from a snake or bandits or anything so simple. You saved me from becoming a bitter old man. Alone with my cattle and my stubborn pride, I'd face down the whole territory for you. She smiled then, brilliant and unguarded in a way he'd never seen before. You won't have to face them alone. As sleep finally claimed them, the storm began to pass, leaving the air clean and fresh. In the morning, they would face the world as partners, united against whatever challenges came their way. But for now, there was only the peaceful sound of breathing in unison and the knowledge that neither of them would be alone again. The gift Chief Nache had sent had become something neither the giver nor receiver could have imagined. Not an obligation or a debt repaid, but a true partnership born of choice and nurtured by love. In the harsh landscape of the New Mexico territory, where survival often meant isolation and hardship, they had found in each other a reason to hope for more than mere existence, and that, Luke thought as he drifted off to sleep with Annabelle warm in his arms, was the greatest gift of all. The morning after the storm dawned crystal clear, with that peculiar quality of light that comes after rain has washed the dust from the air. Luke woke first, momentarily disoriented by the warmth beside him, then remembered with a rush of wonder and contentment. Annabelle was still sleeping, her auburn hair spread across his shoulder, one hand resting on his chest. He lay still, not wanting to wake her, marveling at how natural this felt. All those months of careful distance. And now he couldn't imagine starting a day any other way. But as the sun climbed higher, the demands of the ranch intruded. The cattle would need checking after the storm. Fences might be down, and there was always work to be done. When he carefully extracted himself from their makeshift bed by the fireplace, Annabelle stirred and opened her eyes. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across her features, as if she too was remembering the line they'd crossed. Then Luke smiled at her, soft and sure, and her face relaxed. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning," she replied, then surprised him by adding, "I was afraid I'd dreamed it all." "No dream," Luke assured her, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Though if it was, I wouldn't want to wake up." Their first day as acknowledged lovers was marked by small changes, lingering touches as they passed, shared smiles over breakfast, the ease of standing close without the old careful distance. But there was work to be done, and they fell into their familiar rhythms, albeit with a new undercurrent of awareness. It was mid-morning when Luke suggested they ride out together to check the north pasture. "I want to show you something," he said, saddling both Moses and the painted mare Annabelle had arrived on, now named Luna. They rode in companionable silence, following a trail that wound up into the foothills. The storm had left the landscape refreshed, wildflowers blooming in unexpected profusion. After an hour's ride, Luke led them off the main trail to a small box canyon he'd discovered years ago. A spring bubbled up from the rocks there, creating a small pool surrounded by cottonwoods and willows. The walls of the canyon were painted with ancient symbols, remnants of the peoples who had lived here long before. "It's beautiful," Annabelle breathed, dismounting to explore. She traced her fingers over some of the rock art, her expression reverent. "The Apache would consider this a sacred place. I've always thought of it as special," Luke admitted. "Never showed anyone else before, but I wanted to share it with you." She turned to him, understanding in her eyes. This wasn't just about showing her a pretty spot. This was about letting her into the private corners of his life, the places he'd kept separate and protected. They spent the afternoon there, talking about dreams and plans. Luke spoke of expanding the ranch, maybe running some sheep along with cattle. Annabelle shared her hope of starting a proper garden, maybe even an orchard if they could manage the irrigation. Luke noticed she was saying "we" now, including herself in the future of the ranch. It sent a warm feeling through his chest. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, they reluctantly mounted up for the ride home. They were perhaps a mile from the cabin when Luke spotted the dust cloud, riders approaching from the direction of town. "Company," he said, tension creeping into his voice. Unannounced visitors were rarely good news on the frontier. As the riders drew closer, Luke recognized Sam Morrison, the territorial marshal, along with 2 deputies. His hand moved instinctively closer to his rifle, though he kept the gesture casual. "Afternoon, Luke," Marshal Morrison called out as they met on the trail. His eyes moved to Annabelle, taking in her presence with professional interest. "Miss Marshal?" Luke replied evenly. "What brings you out this way?" "Looking for someone," Morrison said. "Woman named Annabelle Morrison. No relation, despite the name. Run off from a situation in Albuquerque. Her employers filed charges, theft, breach of contract." Luke felt Annabelle stiffen beside him, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I'm Annabelle Morrison, and Harold Jameson is a liar." The marshal studied her carefully. "You're not denying you're the woman in question?" "I'm not denying my name or that I left Jameson's employ," Annabelle said clearly. "I am denying any theft, unless you count taking myself away from a man who—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Who had plans for me that went well beyond housekeeping." Morrison's expression didn't change, but Luke caught the slight tightening around his eyes. He'd been a lawman long enough to recognize the truth when he heard it. "Jameson says you took money and jewelry," the marshal continued. "Duty-bound to pursue the allegations?" "Then let him prove it," Luke interjected. Let him come here himself and make those accusations to her face, in front of witnesses. Or better yet, let him explain to a judge why he abandoned a woman he'd contracted to marry at a stage station with nothing but the clothes on her back. You know about that? Morrison asked. I know all of it, Luke said firmly. Miss Morrison has been employed here as a housekeeper for months now. She's worked honestly for every penny paid, and I'll swear to that in any court. The marshal was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Jameson didn't mention the marriage contract, just said she was a servant who'd robbed him. He looked at Annabelle. You have proof of the original arrangement? I have letters, Annabelle said. His letters, promising marriage, a home, respectability. All lies, but his own hand convicted him. I'll need to see those letters, Morrison said, but his tone had shifted. He was going through the motions now. Luke could tell. Back at the cabin, Annabelle retrieved a small packet of letters from her trunk in the loft. Luke had never asked about them, respecting her privacy, but now he saw her hands shake slightly as she handed them over. The marshal read through them quickly, his face darkening with each page. These paint a very different picture than the one Jameson presented, he said finally. Miss Morrison, I'll need you to write out your version of events. I suspect when I return to Albuquerque with this information, Mr. Jameson will suddenly decide to drop his charges. And if he doesn't, Luke asked. Morrison's smile was grim. Then he'll have to explain to a judge why he's pursuing a woman he contracted to marry, then abandoned. The territorial courts take a dim view of such behavior, especially when the abandoned party is a respectable woman. He tipped his hat to Annabelle. I apologize for the disturbance, ma'am. We'll camp down by the creek tonight and be on our way in the morning. After the lawmen had left to make their camp, Luke found Annabelle standing on the porch, arms wrapped around herself despite the warm evening. You all right? He asked, coming to stand beside her. I thought it was over, she said quietly. I thought I'd left all that behind. It is over, Luke said firmly. Morrison's a good man. He'll handle Jameson. The man's a coward. He won't pursue this once he realizes you have support. Support, Annabelle repeated, a wondering note in her voice. I've never had that before. Luke turned her to face him. You do now. Always. She searched his face, then rose on her toes to kiss him. When they parted, some of the tension had left her shoulders. I should start supper. The marshal and his men will be hungry in the morning. Least we can do is feed them before they leave. That night, they made love properly in Luke's bed, no longer needing the excuse of storm or cold. It was different from their first desperate coming together, slower, more exploring, learning each other's responses and preferences. Luke discovered that Annabelle had a sensitive spot just below her ear that made her gasp when he kissed it. She found that running her fingers through his hair could make him groan with pleasure. Afterward, as they lay entwined, Annabelle traced the scar on Luke's shoulder from a long-ago riding accident. No more secrets between us, she said softly. No more careful distances. No more. Luke agreed, though there is one thing we should probably discuss. She tensed slightly. What? Making this official, legal. I know you've had a bad experience with the idea of marriage, but... Annabelle placed her fingers over his lips, silencing him. Luke Tanners, are you proposing to me? I'm doing a poor job of it, he admitted. I don't have a ring, and we're not exactly in proper circumstances, but yes, I'm asking if you'll marry me. Not because of propriety or what people might say, but because I want everyone to know you're my wife. Because I want the law on our side if anyone ever tries to take you away from me again. Tears glittered in her eyes. You're proposing to protect me. I'm proposing because I love you. Luke corrected. The protection is just an added benefit. I want to build a life with you. Annabelle, official-like, with papers and witnesses and whatever else it takes to make sure everyone knows we belong together. Yes, she whispered. Oh, yes. They sealed the engagement with a kiss that led to other things, and it was near dawn before they slept again. True to his word, Marshal Morrison and his men departed after breakfast, but not before the marshal took Luke aside. Jameson has powerful friends, he warned. He might not give up easily, even with the evidence against him. Then he'll learn what happens when he threatens what's mine, Luke said simply. Morrison smiled. Figured you'd say that. Congratulations, by the way. She's a fine woman. How did you? Son, I've been a lawman for 20 years. I can tell when two people are together. Besides, the way you defended her yesterday made it pretty clear. He mounted his horse. Take care of her. Tanner's. And watch your back. As the lawman rode away, Luke found Annabelle in the garden plot she'd been working to expand. She was kneeling in the dirt, planting seeds with careful precision. Planning for the future? He asked, crouching beside her. Our future, she corrected, smiling up at him. These are apple seeds, from the Apache. They'll take years to bear fruit, but when they do, we'll have an orchard, Luke finished. Our children will eat apples from trees their mother planted. Annabelle's hand stilled. Children? If we're blessed with them, Luke said carefully, aware this was new territory. Would you want that? She was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I never thought I'd have the chance. Never thought I'd trust anyone enough. But yes, I want children. Your children. They worked side by side in the garden until the sun grew too hot, planting the seeds of their future together. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold, Luke reflected on how much had changed since that winter day when he'd found two Apache girls in the snow. One act of kindness had led to this, to love, to partnership, to a future bright with promise. Chief Nache had sent him a gift, but not in the way anyone had expected. Not a possession or a servant, but a partner, an equal, a woman who'd saved him even as he'd offered her sanctuary. What are you thinking? Annabelle asked, leaning against his shoulder. About gifts. Luke said, about how the best ones come in ways we don't expect. She smiled, understanding perfectly. Like a rancher who sees a woman, not damaged goods. That's a gift too, you know. We gifted each other, Luke decided, pulling her closer. And I plan to spend the rest of my life being grateful for it. As darkness settled over the ranch, they went inside together. No longer two separate people maintaining careful boundaries, but partners facing whatever the future might bring. The stars emerged one by one overhead, bearing witness to a love that had grown from the unlikely soil of obligation and blossomed into something genuine and lasting. In the New Mexico territory, where the land was harsh and unforgiving, they had created their own small paradise. And that, Luke thought as he held Annabelle close, was the greatest gift of all. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, brought by a passing freighter who'd picked it up in Socorro. Luke was shoeing one of the horses when Annabelle brought it to him, her face pale despite the warm autumn sun. It's from Albuquerque, she said quietly, holding out the envelope as if it might bite. Luke set down his tools and took the letter, noting the expensive paper and formal script inside. The message was brief but chilling. Harold Jameson was coming to collect his property and would arrive within the week. He claimed to have new evidence of theft and expected full cooperation from local authorities. He can't still believe he has any claim on me, Annabelle said, but her voice trembled slightly. Luke crumpled the letter in his fist. He doesn't. This is about pride now, and power. Men like Jameson can't stand being defied, especially by a woman. That evening, they sat on the porch and made plans. Luke wanted to ride to Socorro, gather support from the few friends he'd made among the other ranchers. But Annabelle shook her head. Running to others for help will only make him think we're weak, she said. I won't give him that satisfaction. Then what do you suggest? She was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the mountains. I face him, here, on our land. I show him that I'm not the frightened woman he abandoned at that stage station. Not alone, Luke said firmly. No, she agreed, taking his hand. Never alone again. They spent the next days preparing, though for what exactly, they couldn't say. Luke cleaned and oiled his weapons, rode the boundaries of his land, made sure everything was in order. Annabelle went about her usual tasks with determined calm, though Luke noticed her hands sometimes trembled when she thought he wasn't looking. On the 5th day, as morning broke clear and cool, they saw the dust cloud approaching from the north, 3 riders, moving at a steady pace. Luke stood on the porch, rifle prominently displayed but not threatening. Annabelle emerged from the cabin to stand beside him, wearing her best dress, the one she'd made herself from fabric bought with her own earned money. Harold Jameson hadn't improved with time. He was still a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the florid face of someone too fond of whiskey and the soft look of someone who paid others to do his hard work. His 2 companions were obviously hired muscle, their hands resting casually near their weapons. "Miss Morrison," Jameson called out as they reined in at a respectful distance. "You've led me quite a chase." "Mrs. Tanner's," Annabelle corrected coolly. "And you've wasted a journey, Mr. Jameson. I have nothing that belongs to you." Jameson's face darkened. "Mrs. Tanner's, is it? No legal marriage could have taken place without my permission. You were under contract to me." "A contract for marriage," Luke interjected, "which you broke when you abandoned her. Any claim you had ended then." Jameson barely glanced at him. "I'm not here to debate with frontier trash. Annabelle, you took valuable items from my home. Return them, and we can discuss reducing the charges." "I took nothing," Annabelle said clearly. "As I told the marshal, as I'll tell any judge, you're the thief here, Mr. Jameson. You stole my trust, my hopes, and very nearly my life when you left me to die." "Dramatic nonsense," Jameson scoffed. "I paid for your passage west. You owe me—" "She owes you nothing," Luke cut in, his voice hard. "And you'll address my wife with respect, or you'll leave our land immediately." One of Jameson's hired men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving slightly. Luke's rifle swung toward him in a motion so smooth it seemed casual. "I wouldn't," he said quietly. The tension stretched taut, but it was broken by an unexpected sound. Horses approaching from the east. Luke risked a glance and felt his heart lift. Marshal Morrison was riding in with his 2 deputies, but more surprisingly, he was accompanied by several Apache warriors, including the silver-haired chief who'd visited Luke's ranch months ago. "Gentlemen," the marshal called out cheerfully, "hope I'm not interrupting anything. Mr. Jameson, I thought I might find you here." Jameson's face went from florid to pale. "Marshal, I was just discussing the return of my property with Mrs. Tanner's." Morrison interrupted. "Yes, I've been looking into your claims. Interesting thing. I found several other women who answered your advertisements over the years. None of them lasted long in your employ. One of them, a Miss Sarah Collins, had some very interesting things to say about valuable items that went missing from her trunk while she was in your house, items that later showed up in your possession. That's preposterous," Jameson blustered, but sweat had begun to bead on his forehead. "Is it?" Morrison dismounted, pulling a paper from his coat. "I have here a sworn statement from Miss Collins. Seems you have a pattern, Mr. Jameson. Bring women west with promises of marriage. Find some excuse to dismiss them, then claim they stole from you. Only this time, you picked the wrong woman." The Apache chief urged his horse forward, in accented but clear English. He spoke. "This woman is under the protection of my people. She saved the lives of my sister's daughters. The debt of honor is ours. You threaten her. You threaten all Apache." Jameson looked around wildly, realizing he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. This is not legal. You can't threaten." "No one's threatening anyone," Morrison said mildly. "I'm simply informing you that any charges against Mrs. Tanner's have been dropped. Furthermore, you're under arrest for fraud and false accusations. Boys," he nodded to his deputies, who moved their horses to flank Jameson. "This is outrageous," Jameson shouted. "I have friends. Influence—" "Not here," Luke said quietly. "Here, you're just a man who tried to hurt my wife. Be grateful the law got to you first." As the deputies led Jameson away, still protesting, The Apache chief dismounted and approached the porch. He nodded gravely to Luke, then turned to Annabelle. "You are well?" he asked. "I am well." She replied in Apache, "Surprising everyone. Your gift of language has served me well, grandfather." A rare smile crossed the chief's weathered face. "The gift was not language. The gift was courage. You already had that." He turned to Luke. "You have chosen well. Rancher, both of you." After the Apache had departed and the dust had settled, Luke and Annabelle stood alone on their porch. The threat that had hung over them for months was gone, dispersed like morning mist. "It's over," Annabelle said wonderingly. "Really over." "That part is," Luke agreed, pulling her close. "But we're just beginning." That night, they celebrated quietly. Sharing a bottle of wine Luke had been saving for a special occasion. They talked about the future without the shadow of Jameson hanging over them, the improvements they'd make to the ranch, the trip to Socorro to make their marriage official in the eyes of the law, the children they hoped to have. "I was terrified," Annabelle admitted as they lay in bed later. "When I saw him riding up, part of me was that scared girl at the stage station again." "But you didn't show it," Luke said, stroking her hair. "You stood tall and faced him down. Because you were beside me," she said. "Because I knew I wasn't alone." The next morning brought a surprise. As they were having breakfast, they heard singing approaching the cabin, Apache voices raised in what sounded like celebration. Looking out, they saw a small procession approaching, the two sisters Luke had saved, now healthy and vibrant, accompanied by several other Apache women and warriors. Maria and Elena rushed to embrace first Luke, then Annabelle, chattering excitedly in a mix of Apache and broken English. They'd heard about the confrontation with Jameson, about how Annabelle had stood strong. "We bring gifts," Maria said carefully in English, gesturing to the pack horses. "For wedding, for sister." The gifts were practical and beautiful. Blankets woven with intricate patterns, pottery for the kitchen, seeds for Annabelle's garden, and a cradle board decorated with beads and feathers. "For baby's coming," Elena said shyly, making Annabelle blush and Luke grin. They spent the day in celebration, Apache and white together, sharing food and stories. Luke watched Annabelle moving among their guests, translating, laughing, fully at ease with both worlds she inhabited. This was what Jameson could never understand. That strength came not from dominance, but from connection, from the bonds between people who chose to support each other. As the sun set and their guests prepared to leave, the chief's sister, Maria and Elena's mother, took Annabelle aside. She pressed something into her hands, a necklace of turquoise and silver, old and obviously precious. "For strong woman," she said in English. "Wear at wedding, bring blessing." Annabelle's eyes filled with tears as she embraced the older woman. "Thank you," she whispered in Apache. "For everything." After their guests had gone, Luke and Annabelle sat on the porch in the gathering darkness. Annabelle wore the turquoise necklace, the stones catching the last light. "You know what I realized today?" she said softly. "What's that?" "I'm not between two worlds anymore. I'm not white trying to be Apache or Apache trying to be white. I'm just me, Annabelle Morrison Tanners, who belongs right here, with you on this land, with these people, all of them, as our community." Luke lifted her hand to his lips. "That's the woman I fell in love with. All of you, not just parts, even the complicated parts, especially those," he assured her. A wolf howled in the distance, answered by another and another. The sound that once might have seemed lonely now felt like a reminder that even in the vastness of the frontier, no creature was truly alone. "Next week, we go to Socorro." Luke said, "Make our marriage official in the law books." "And after that?" "After that, we come home and build our life, season by season, year by year, together." Annabelle leaned against him, the turquoise necklace warm against her throat, the stars emerging overhead like promises of all the tomorrows to come. "That sounds perfect," she said. "In the morning, there would be work. There was always work on a ranch. But tonight, They sat together in peaceful silence. Two people who had found each other across impossible odds and chosen to build something lasting from the gifts they'd been given, both expected and unexpected. The land stretched out around them, harsh and beautiful, demanding and generous by turns. They would face whatever it brought together, strengthened by the knowledge that they had already survived the worst: loneliness, abandonment, fear, and emerged not just intact but triumphant. As the stars wheeled overhead and the night sounds of the desert rose around them, Luke and Annabelle Tanners sat on their porch, hands entwined, hearts at peace, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring to their small corner of the vast frontier. The nightmare came to Annabelle on a cold March night, 3 weeks after their wedding in Socorro. She woke gasping, her nightdress soaked with sweat, the dream's images still vivid, rough hands grabbing her, Jameson's leering face, being dragged away while Luke stood frozen, unable to help. "Shh, it's all right," Luke murmured, gathering her against him. "You're safe. I'm here." But the trembling wouldn't stop. Even after Jameson's arrest, even after their beautiful wedding ceremony with Marshall Morrison and his wife as witnesses, the fear lingered in the dark corners of her mind. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought I was past this." "Nothing to apologize for." Luke said firmly, "That man put you through hell. It takes time to heal from that." The next morning, Annabelle threw herself into work with unusual intensity, scrubbing floors that were already clean, reorganizing shelves that didn't need it. Luke watched with growing concern, but knew better than to push. She'd talk when she was ready. It was near sunset when he found her in the barn, sitting in the hay with tears streaming down her face. He sat beside her without speaking, offering his presence without demands. "There are things I didn't tell you," she said finally, "about my time with Jameson. Before I ran." Luke's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice gentle. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share." "But I do," she insisted, "because keeping it secret gives it power over me." She took a shuddering breath. He tried to force himself on me. The night before I ran, I fought him off, hit him with a poker from the fireplace. That's when I knew I had to leave, no matter the cost." Luke's hands clenched into fists, rage flooding through him. If Jameson weren't already in custody. "I've been so afraid," Annabelle continued. "Not just of him finding me, but of being that helpless again, of having someone try to take choice away from me." "Look at me," Luke said softly. When she met his eyes, he continued, "You're the strongest person I know. You fought him off. You survived on your own. You built a new life. That's not helpless. That's powerful." "I don't feel powerful. I feel broken sometimes." Luke cupped her face gently. "We're all broken in some ways, but broken doesn't mean worthless. Sometimes the mended places are the strongest parts." They sat in the barn until full darkness fell, Annabelle gradually relaxing against him as she unburdened herself of memories she'd carried alone for too long. When they finally returned to the cabin, something had shifted. The sharing of her deepest shame had not weakened their bond, but strengthened it. 2 days later, unexpected visitors arrived. Luke was repairing a corral fence when he spotted a small group approaching, 2 riders and a wagon. As they drew closer, he recognized one of the riders as Samuel Barnes, a rancher from the far side of Socorro. "Afternoon, Luke," Barnes called out. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion. Got some folks here looking for work, and I remembered you mentioning you could use help come spring." The wagon held a family, a man, woman, and 2 children. They looked road-worn but clean, their possessions neat despite the obvious poverty. The man climbed down, hat in hand. "Name's Thomas Porter," he said. "This is my wife, Mary, and our boys, James and little David. Mr. Barnes said you might have work." Luke assessed them quickly. Thomas had the calloused hands of a worker. Mary, the careful mending on their clothes, spoke of pride despite hardship. The boys, perhaps 10 and 7, watched with bright, curious eyes. "Where you folks from?" Luke asked. "Kansas, originally." Thomas replied, "Drought took our farm. We've been working our way west, looking for a new start." Luke glanced toward the cabin, where Annabelle had emerged to observe the newcomers. She gave him a small nod. Her judgment of people had proven sound. "I could use help with spring branding and building new corrals," Luke said. "Can't pay much, but there's an old line shack about a mile east. Roof's good. Has a working chimney. You'd be welcome to fix it up. Stay as long as the work holds out." Relief washed over Thomas's face. "We're grateful, Mr. Tanners. We'll work hard, I promise you that." As the porters settled in, Annabelle took Mary under her wing, sharing supplies and advice about managing in the high country. The boys, initially shy, soon warmed to her, especially when she produced cookies from her seemingly endless supply. "You're good with children," Luke observed that evening. Annabelle smiled softly. "They're sweet boys. Reminds me why we're building all this, not just for us, but for the future." The presence of the Porter family brought new energy to the ranch. Thomas proved to be a skilled worker, and Mary helped Annabelle with the expanding garden. The boys, when not doing chores, explored the land with the boundless enthusiasm of youth. It was young James who made the discovery that would change everything. "Mr. Luke! Mr. Luke!" The boy came running from the direction of the eastern pasture, his face flushed with excitement. "I found something!" Luke followed the boy to a section of eroded bank where spring runoff had washed away years of accumulated soil. There, gleaming in the late afternoon sun, was a vein of white quartz shot through with something that made Luke's heart race: gold. "Is that what I think it is?" Thomas asked. Having followed them, Luke chipped off a piece with his knife, examining it closely. His father had taught him to recognize gold ore years ago, though he'd never expected to find it on his own land. "Looks like it," he said carefully. "Not a rich vein, but gold nonetheless. Word of gold could bring trouble, claim jumpers, speculators, all manner of difficulties." Luke swore both Thomas and James to secrecy until he could file the proper claims. That night, he and Annabelle discussed this unexpected development. "It could change everything," Annabelle said. "Even a small mine could provide security we've only dreamed of. It could also bring problems," Luke countered. "Gold makes people crazy. Then we'll be smart about it," she said pragmatically. "File the claims properly. Work it ourselves with people we trust, not get greedy." Luke smiled at her practical wisdom. "How did I get so lucky to marry a woman with beauty and brains?" "Flattery will get you everywhere," she teased, then grew serious. "We should tell the Porters they're partners in this. They're taking the same risks we are." Luke agreed. The next morning, they called the Porter family together and laid out a proposal. The Porters would get a 25% share of anything the mine produced, in addition to wages. In return, they'd help work the claim and keep it secret until everything was legal. Mary Porter burst into tears. "You don't know what this means," she said. "A real chance to build something, to have a future for our boys." "We know exactly what it means," Annabelle said gently. "Everyone deserves that chance." They filed the claim in Socorro quietly, Luke using connections to keep it as low profile as possible. Then the real work began. Mining, even small scale, was hard labor. They worked in shifts, Luke and Thomas breaking rock while Annabelle and Mary processed the ore, separating gold from quartz. The boys helped by hauling water and sorting rocks, turning it into a game. Their laughter echoed off the canyon walls, a sound that made Annabelle pause sometimes, her hand going to her still flat belly with a secret smile. She hadn't told Luke yet, waiting for the right moment, but she was fairly certain now. The morning sickness, the missed monthly, the bone-deep tiredness despite her happiness. Their child would arrive with the winter. The moment came one evening as they sat by the spring Luke had shown her months ago, their private sanctuary. The sunset painted the rocks in shades of rose and gold, and the air was soft with coming summer. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand. Luke looked at her expectantly, and she placed his palm flat against her belly. "By Christmas, we'll need that cradle the Apache gave us." The joy that transformed his face was something she'd remember forever. He pulled her close, laughing and crying at once, spinning her around until she protested, laughing herself. "A baby," he kept saying. "Our baby. Our baby," she confirmed. "Born on land we own, into a family we've chosen and built." They told the Porters the next day, and Mary immediately began planning. Baby clothes to sew, preparations to make. It felt like the whole ranch was expecting, not just Annabelle. The gold mine, while not rich, proved steady. They extracted enough to pay off Luke's remaining debts on the land, to build proper buildings, to save for the future. But more valuable than the gold was the community growing around them, the Porters, the Apache who visited regularly, the few neighboring ranchers who'd become friends. One hot July day, as Annabelle rested in the shade, Luke had become almost comically protective as her pregnancy advanced. A lone rider approached. For a moment, her heart clenched. Old fears died hard. But as the rider drew closer, she recognized him as a young Apache warrior, one of the chief's nephews. He dismounted gracefully and approached with signs of respect. In careful English, he delivered his message. "My uncle sends word. The man Jameson. He died in the prison. His heart gave out. You are free of him forever." Annabelle felt something release in her chest, a tension she hadn't fully realized she still carried. "Thank you for bringing word," she told the young man. "Will you stay for a meal?" As they fed their guest and heard news from the Apache camp, Annabelle marveled at how far she'd come. From abandoned mail-order bride to ranch wife, from victim to victor, from alone to surrounded by chosen family. That night, she felt the baby move for the first time, a flutter like butterfly wings. She grabbed Luke's hand, pressing it to the spot, and his face lit up when he felt it too. "Strong already," he said with pride. "Like the father." Annabelle replied, "And the mother too, I suppose." "Especially the mother," Luke said firmly. As summer gave way to autumn, the ranch prospered. The garden produced abundantly, preserved for winter by Annabelle and Mary working together. The cattle were healthy, the mine continued its steady yield, and the buildings were snug against coming cold. Annabelle stood on the porch one evening, watching Luke and Thomas working on a cradle in the barn, the Porter boys helping with eager enthusiasm. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, feeling the life within responding to her touch. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd answered that long-ago advertisement. It was infinitely better, built on truth instead of lies, choice instead of desperation, love instead of mere survival. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The baby's arrival loomed with equal parts joy and trepidation. Winter would test their preparations. The mine would need careful management to avoid attracting the wrong attention. But tonight, surrounded by the family they'd built through trust and generosity, with their child growing beneath her heart and their future secured by their own hard work, Annabelle Morrison Tanners knew she was exactly where she belonged. The girl who'd been abandoned at a stage station was gone. In her place stood a woman of strength and substance, partner to a good man, friend to many, soon-to-be mother. The transformation was complete, and the future stretched before them bright with promise. The November morning dawned cold and crisp as Luke hitched the wagon for the journey to Socorro. Annabelle, now heavily pregnant, had insisted on making this trip despite his protests. The courthouse summons couldn't be ignored. Apparently, Jameson's estate was challenging their marriage, claiming rights to his abandoned property. "I won't hide," Annabelle said firmly as Luke helped her onto the wagon seat. "Not anymore. Never again." Mary Porter stood in the doorway of their cabin, having promised to look after the ranch. "You show them what you're made of, Mrs. Tanners," she called. The ride to town was slow, Luke taking care to avoid the worst ruts. Annabelle sat straight-backed despite her discomfort, the turquoise necklace from the Apache visible above her wool coat. As they entered Socorro, Heads turned to watch their passage. News of the hearing had spread. The courthouse was packed. Luke recognized several ranchers he'd had dealings with, Marshal Morrison and his wife, even some of the Apache, including Chief Nache himself. But his attention fixed on the group near the front, a well-dressed lawyer from Albuquerque, and beside him, a woman in black bombazine who bore an unfortunate resemblance to the late Harold Jameson. His sister, Annabelle murmured. Eugenia Jameson. Harold mentioned her once, said she was even greedier than he was. Judge William Thornton, a fair man by reputation, called the hearing to order. The Albuquerque lawyer, a Mr. Cornelius Pratt, rose immediately. Your Honor, we contend that the woman calling herself Annabelle Tanners was, in fact, bound by contract to my late client. Her marriage is therefore invalid, and she remains part of Mr. Jameson's estate. Luke felt Annabelle tense beside him, but she remained silent, letting their lawyer, a young man named Robert Clearwater, whom Marshal Morrison had recommended, respond. Your Honor, Clearwater began. We have here the original correspondence between Mr. Jameson and Miss Morrison, clearly stating the nature of their agreement was matrimonial. We also have sworn testimony from the stage station operator confirming Mr. Jameson abandoned my client with no money or provisions. Lies, Eugenia Jameson hissed. That creature stole from my brother. Judge Thornton's gavel cracked sharply. Ma'am, you'll remain silent unless called upon. The hearing continued for an hour, each side presenting evidence. Then Judge Thornton did something unexpected. He asked Annabelle to speak for herself. She rose carefully, one hand supporting her belly. Your Honor, I came west believing in a promise of marriage and a home. What I found was a man who saw me as property to be discarded when I didn't meet his specifications. Her voice grew stronger. I was left to die. The Apache saved me, gave me dignity when my own people wouldn't. I worked honestly, found real love, built a real home. I am no man's property. I never was. Pretty speech, Pratt interjected. But contracts, Mr. Pratt. The judge interrupted. I've reviewed these contracts. They promise marriage, not servitude. Mr. Jameson broke that contract when he abandoned Miss Morrison. Furthermore, he lifted a paper. I have here a very interesting deposition from a Miss Sarah Collins regarding Mr. Jameson's pattern of behavior. Eugenia Jameson's face went pale. Clearly, she had known about her brother's other victims. It's my ruling, Judge Thornton continued, that no valid claim exists. The marriage of Luke and Annabelle Tanners is legal and binding. Furthermore, any harassment of Mrs. Tanners will be met with the full force of the law. His gavel came down with finality. The courtroom erupted. Well-wishers surrounded Luke and Annabelle while Eugenia Jameson stormed out, her lawyer trailing behind. Chief Nache approached, his weathered face showing rare emotion. You spoke well, daughter, he said in Apache, then switched to English for Luke's benefit. Your children will be proud. As they were preparing to leave, Annabelle suddenly gripped Luke's arm, her face contorting. Oh, she gasped. Oh no, not now. What's wrong? Luke asked, alarmed. The baby. She managed. I think it's coming. Doctor. Sarah Winters, Socorro's only female physician, had just returned from a house call when Luke practically carried Annabelle into her clinic. The doctor, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who'd come west after her husband died in the war, took one look and began issuing orders. First baby, she asked briskly, helping Annabelle onto the examination table. Yes. Annabelle gasped between contractions. Early by your count. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Doctor. Winters nodded. The stress of the hearing, most likely. Don't worry. Baby seems to have its own schedule. Mr. Tanners, go boil water. Lots of it. Luke hesitated, not wanting to leave Annabelle's side. Go, Annabelle urged. I'll be fine. The next hours were the longest of Luke's life. He paced the small waiting room, jumping at every sound from behind the closed door. Marshal Morrison appeared at some point with coffee and quiet company. Word had spread through town, and it seemed half of Socorro was keeping vigil. As sunset painted the sky crimson, a new sound pierced the air, the strong, healthy cry of a baby. Luke was on his feet instantly as Dr. Winters emerged, smiling. "Congratulations, Mr. Tanners, you have a daughter." A daughter? Luke's knees nearly buckled as he followed the doctor into the room. Annabelle lay propped against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in clean white cloth. "Meet your daughter?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The baby was perfect, a shock of dark hair, tiny fists waving, her cries already settling as she nestled against her mother. Luke touched her impossibly small hand, and tiny fingers wrapped around his with surprising strength. "She's beautiful." He managed past the lump in his throat. "What should we call her?" Annabelle smiled. "I was thinking, Hope. Hope Catherine Tanners. For the future, and to honor your past." Luke kissed her forehead. "Then the babies." "Hope it is." They stayed in Socorro for 3 days while Annabelle recovered enough to travel. The town's women, even those who'd initially been cool toward the Apache woman, brought food and baby clothes. Eugenia Jameson and her lawyer had disappeared, apparently accepting defeat. The ride home was slow and careful. Hope sleeping contentedly in a basket lined with soft blankets. As they crested the final ridge, Luke heard Annabelle's soft gasp. The ranch was decorated with Apache symbols of welcome and protection. The Porter family stood waiting along with several Apache women, including Maria and Elena. A feast was already being prepared. "How did they know?" Annabelle asked wonderingly. "Riders left town right after Hope was born." Luke explained, "Good news travels fast out here." The celebration lasted well into the night. Hope was passed from arm to arm, blessed in multiple languages, welcomed into a community that transcended the usual boundaries of race and culture. Watching Annabelle laugh with the Apache women while Mary Porter cooed over the baby, Luke marveled at how rich their lives had become. Later, as the guests departed and quiet settled over the ranch, Luke found Annabelle in their bedroom, nursing Hope by lamplight. He sat beside them, still awed by the miracle of his daughter. "No regrets?" Annabelle asked softly. "About taking in a broken mail-order bride?" "You were never broken," Luke said firmly. "Maybe a little bent by circumstances, but never broken. And you weren't taken in, you were chosen. I'd choose you again every day for the rest of my life." Annabelle leaned against his shoulder, Hope making small, contented sounds between them. "Today in court, when that horrible woman called me a creature, for a moment, I almost believed her. Then I looked around that room, at you, at our friends, at people who saw me as a person worth defending, and I knew she was wrong. Harold Jameson and his kind, they're the broken ones, unable to see value in anything they can't own or control. You showed them today," Luke said. "Showed them all what real strength looks like." Hope finished nursing and Luke took her carefully, marveling at how natural it felt already. He walked to the window, showing his daughter the stars beginning to emerge in the clear sky. "See all that, little one?" he whispered. "That's your world, wide and free and full of possibilities. Your mama and I will make sure you never have to doubt your worth or fight for your right to choose your own path." Annabelle joined them at the window, her arm around Luke's waist. "She'll grow up knowing she was wanted, chosen, loved. She'll have the childhood neither of us did. She'll have everything," Luke agreed, then amended. "Everything that matters, anyway. Love, family, freedom, a place to belong." As they stood there, their daughter between them and their chosen family sleeping peacefully in cabins nearby, the future stretched out like the vast landscape beyond their window. There would be challenges. There always were on the frontier, but they would face them together, strengthened by the bonds they'd forged through choice and trust rather than mere circumstance. Hope yawned hugely for such a tiny person, and her parents laughed softly. Tomorrow would bring its own tasks and tests. But tonight, in their home built by love and determination, all was well. The mail-order bride who'd never been delivered had found her true destination. The lonely rancher had discovered that the best gifts come in unexpected packages. And now their daughter would grow up in a world where people could define themselves by their choices rather than others' expectations. As they settled Hope into her cradle, the one Luke and Thomas had built with such care, Annabelle began to hum an Apache lullaby. The melody drifted through the cabin, out into the night air, a bridge between worlds and a promise of all the tomorrows yet to come. In the morning, they would write to the lawyers, formally refusing any claim from the Jameson estate. They would record Hope's birth in the family Bible. They would plan for her future, education, opportunities, the chance to become whatever she chose. But for now, they simply stood watch over their sleeping daughter. Two people who had found each other across impossible odds and created something beautiful from the ashes of old pain. The transformation was complete. The mail-order bride's journey ended not in the destination others had chosen, but in a home she'd helped build with her own hands and heart. And that, Luke thought as he kissed his wife and checked on his daughter one more time before seeking his own rest, was the greatest gift of all. Not the gold in their mine or the cattle in their fields, but this family forged by choice, this love earned through trial, this future bright with promise under the vast New Mexico sky. Spring arrived early in 1891, bringing with it the sweet scent of wildflowers and new beginnings. Hope, now just over a year old, toddled through the garden on unsteady legs, chasing butterflies while Annabelle tended the young apple trees that had finally begun to bloom. "Look, sweetling," Annabelle said, lifting her daughter to see the delicate white blossoms. "Your trees are flowering. By the time you're old enough to climb them, they'll be bearing fruit." Hope reached for the flowers with chubby fingers, babbling excitedly in a mix of English and Apache words she'd picked up from their frequent visitors. Luke watched from the porch, his morning coffee forgotten as he observed his girls in the garden. The sight still sometimes overwhelmed him. This life he'd built, so different from the solitary existence he'd once resigned himself to. Letter came. Thomas Porter called out, walking up from the main road where he'd met the mail carrier. "Looks official." Luke's stomach tightened slightly. Official letters rarely brought good news, but he kept his expression neutral as he took the envelope. The return address made him relax. Robert Clearwater, their lawyer in Socorro. Inside. The news was better than good. The territorial government was offering to buy a right-of-way through their land for a new road connecting Socorro to the mining towns further west. The compensation would be generous, enough to secure Hope's education and expand their operations considerably. "What do you think?" Luke asked Annabelle after explaining the offer. She considered carefully, bouncing Hope on her hip. "A road would bring more people through, change things." "Change isn't always bad," Luke pointed out. "Could mean more market for our cattle, easier transport for the ore, and Hope would have easier access to schools when the time comes," Annabelle added thoughtfully. Then she smiled. "I think we should accept. We can't hold back progress. And this way we benefit from it rather than being run over by it." The decision made, they began planning for the changes to come. But first, there was a more personal matter to attend to. Maria and Elena were returning to visit, and they'd sent word they were bringing someone special. The sisters arrived on a warm May morning, accompanied by a striking young Apache man whom Maria introduced as her husband, Joseph Crow Feather. Elena, now 17 and blossoming into womanhood, carried a bundle of her own, beautiful woven blankets she'd made as gifts. "For Hope's bed," Elena said shyly, "and for the new baby when it comes." Annabelle's hand went unconsciously to her still flat stomach. She'd only just begun to suspect. Hadn't even told Luke yet, but Elena had always been perceptive. That evening, as they all sat around the enlarged table Thomas had built to accommodate their growing circle, Annabelle caught Luke's eye and nodded slightly toward her midsection. His eyes widened, then filled with joy as understanding dawned. "You're certain?" he asked quietly while the others were engaged in conversation. "As certain as I can be this early," she confirmed. "By Christmas, Hope will have a brother or sister. The announcement, when made, brought another round of celebration. Mary Porter immediately began planning baby supplies, while Maria offered to teach Annabelle some of the Apache remedies that helped with pregnancy discomforts. As spring turned to summer, the road construction began. The crews were respectful, keeping to the agreed-upon route, and Luke hired some of them to help expand their irrigation system while they were in the area. The ranch was transforming from a simple homestead into something more substantial. It was during this time of growth and change that the past made one final attempt to intrude. Annabelle was hanging laundry when she saw the rider approaching, a woman in expensive clothes, sitting her horse awkwardly, as if unaccustomed to riding. As the woman drew closer, Annabelle's blood chilled. She knew that face, though it was older and harder than she remembered. Charlotte Morrison, her sister, who had stood silent when their father cast Annabelle out for answering the mail-order bride advertisement. "Hello, Annabelle," Charlotte said, dismounting gracelessly. "You're a hard woman to find." "What do you want?" Annabelle asked, keeping her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly as she set down the wet shirt she'd been holding. "Father's dead," Charlotte said bluntly. "Died last winter, left debts. I need money." The coldness of it, no inquiry about Annabelle's well-being, no acknowledgement of the years of silence, sparked anger rather than hurt. "You need money," Annabelle repeated. "So you come here, after all this time, because you need something." Charlotte's face flushed. "You're my sister. Family helps family." "Family?" Annabelle laughed bitterly. "You stood there while Father called me a disgrace. You let him throw me out with nothing. You never wrote, never tried to find out if I was alive or dead. Now you want to claim kinship because you need money?" "You seem to have done well enough," Charlotte said, gesturing at the thriving ranch. "Surely you can spare something for your blood kin." Before Annabelle could respond, Luke appeared, having heard the raised voices. Hope toddled behind him, curious about the stranger. "Everything all right?" he asked, moving to stand beside his wife. "This is my sister Charlotte," Annabelle said. "She's come to inform me our father is dead and she needs money." Luke studied Charlotte with cool assessment. "I see. And what claim does she think she has on our hard-earned prosperity?" "The claim of blood," Charlotte said desperately. "Surely that means something." "Blood?" Annabelle picked up Hope, holding her daughter close. "This is my blood. This child who will grow up knowing she's loved and valued. My husband, who chose me when everyone else threw me away. The Porters, who work beside us as family. The Apache who saved my life and gave me dignity. That's my blood. The family I chose and who chose me." Charlotte's face crumpled. "Annabelle, please, I have nowhere else to turn." For a moment, Annabelle wavered. Then Hope reached out toward the stranger with the innocent curiosity of a child, and Charlotte recoiled slightly, as if even a baby's touch might contaminate her. "No," Annabelle said firmly. "I'm sorry for your troubles, Charlotte, but you made your choice years ago. You chose comfort and Father's approval over your sister. Now live with that choice. You can't just send me away with nothing." Luke stepped forward. "We can and we will. But because my wife has a kinder heart than you deserve, we'll give you enough for stage fare back to Ohio and a month's lodging. After that, you're on your own." He went into the house and returned with a small pouch of coins. "This is more than you gave your sister when she needed help. Take it and go." Charlotte snatched the pouch, her face ugly with resentment. "You'll regret this selfishness," she spat. "The only thing I regret," Annabelle said quietly, "is that I spent so many years believing I needed your approval, or Father's. I thought being cast out was the worst thing that could happen. Now I know it was the best. It freed me to find my real family." After Charlotte rode away, Annabelle stood quietly for a moment, Luke's arm around her shoulders. Then she took a deep breath and smiled down at Hope, who was playing with her mother's turquoise necklace. "Well," she said, "I suppose that's really the end of it. The last ghost from the past faced and dismissed." That evening, Annabelle sat at her small desk and began to write a letter. not to Charlotte or anyone from her old life, but to Chief Natche. She wrote in careful Apache, thanking him again for the gift he'd sent over 2 years ago. Not just herself, but the chance for both her and Luke to discover what they truly needed. The summer passed peacefully after that. The road was completed, bringing, as predicted, both challenges and opportunities. A small trading post opened at the crossroads, run by a Mexican family who became good neighbors. The Porter boys, now strapping young men, took on more responsibilities, with plans to claim their own homestead on adjoining land when they came of age. Hope grew daily, a bright, laughing child who switched easily between English and Apache, who helped gather eggs and rode in front of her father's saddle when he checked the cattle. Annabelle's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and she often found herself marveling at the difference between carrying this wanted, celebrated child and the fear she'd once felt at the prospect of bearing Jameson's offspring. On a crisp October morning, as Annabelle worked on preserving the last of the garden harvest, she felt the familiar pains beginning. This time, there was no panic, no rushed trip to town, doctor. Winters had agreed to come to the ranch when the time came, and Mary Porter was an experienced midwife herself. The labor was swifter than with hope. By sunset, their son was born, healthy, loud, and perfect. They named him Thomas Luke Tanners, honoring both his father and the friend who'd become like a brother to them. As Annabelle rested with the baby, Hope was brought in to meet her brother. She studied him solemnly, then patted his head gently. "Mine," she announced, making everyone laugh. "Yes, sweetling," Annabelle agreed. "Your brother. You'll help take care of him." That night, as had become tradition, the community gathered to welcome the new arrival, Apache and white, Mexican and Anglo, all united in celebrating new life. Watching the firelight dance on the faces of their chosen family, Annabelle felt a profound sense of completion. She thought of the frightened girl who'd stepped off that stage in Albuquerque, full of desperate hope. That girl couldn't have imagined this. Not just survival, but abundance. Not just shelter, but home. Not just acceptance, but deep, abiding love. "What are you thinking?" Luke asked, sitting beside her on the porch swing he'd built during her pregnancy. "About gifts," Annabelle said. "How the Apache sent me as a gift to you, but really, the gift was what we built together. None of this," she gestured at their children, their friends, their thriving ranch, "would exist if we hadn't both been brave enough to accept what was offered and transform it into something neither of us expected. The best gifts are like that." Luke agreed. They grow into something bigger than the giver imagined. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Maria approached with a small bundle. "From the chief," she said, "for your letter. He says to tell you the debt was always equal. You saved his niece's lives. The Apache gave you a new life, balance." Inside the bundle was a small piece of turquoise, perfectly matched to Annabelle's necklace, and a tiny bow, suitable for a child's hands. Gifts for the future, for the next generation who would grow up bridging worlds. The stars emerged one by one in the vast New Mexico sky, same as they had for countless generations before, and would for countless more to come. Under them, the Tanners family settled in for the night. Parents and children, blood kin and chosen family, all part of the ongoing story of the American frontier. In her final letter to Chief Natche, Annabelle had written, "The gift you sent has borne fruit beyond measure, not just children, though we are blessed with those. Not just prosperity, though we have found that too, but the gift of understanding that home is not a place you're from or sent to, but a place you choose to build with those who choose to build alongside you." As she nursed her son while Luke read to Hope from a picture book Mary Porter had made, Annabelle smiled at the simple perfection of the moment. Somewhere out there, Charlotte was probably still bitter about her reception. Harold Jameson lay in his grave, unmourned by those he'd wronged. But here, in this cabin built by love and determination, life continued in all its messy, beautiful glory. The mail-order bride had found her true destination. The lonely rancher had discovered the family he'd never dared dream of. and together, they'd written a story of triumph over adversity, of love conquering fear, of chosen bonds proving stronger than blood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, children to raise, land to tend, a community to nurture. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of dreams made real, Luke and Annabelle Tanners were simply grateful for the unexpected paths that had brought them together and the courage they'd found to walk those paths side by side. The frontier was changing, becoming settled, civilized. But some things remained eternal. The power of kindness to transform lives, the strength found in diversity, and the truth that the best families are often those we choose rather than those we're born into. And in a small corner of New Mexico territory, those truths were lived out daily, a testament to the enduring power of love over law, choice over circumstance, and hope over fear. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining me on this journey through the Wild West. I hope Luke and Annabelle's story touched your heart as much as it did mine. Where are you listening to this story from? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to know where in the world these tales of the American frontier are reaching. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more authentic stories of love, courage, and redemption from America's past. What did you think of this story? Which part moved you the most? Share your thoughts below. Your comments help bring our community of story lovers together.